Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to UWC Southeast Asia to speak to what we can learn and how we learn for the future. At this moment, our eyes are still very much focused on the pandemic that has deeply disrupted our lives, our education. Well, one thing is clear, the future will always surprise us. Climate change is going to disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic. And artificial intelligence creates so much more uncertainty. We know how to educate second-class robots. People are very good at repeating what we told them. But what will make us human in a world in which the kind of things that are easy to teach and test have also become easy to digitize, to automate? These are the questions we will need to answer. What is the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes and values that help us get ready for an uncertain, volatile, ambiguous world? And of course, there are many other trends that shape our future and the future of education. Let's start with the easy ones, the economic development. There are new sources of growth. You can see very clearly that intangibles have become the key to economic success. An example of their power is the growth of a few tech companies compared to the declining revenue of the companies that traditionally dominated the Fortune 500 some decades ago. The great thing is that unlike tangible assets, knowledge can be used infinitely, repeatedly, in many different places, in many different times. And that's what explains the rapid growth of technology companies these days. They are so good at, producing, disseminating, reusing intangibles. And of course, intangibles are about people, and people are about skills. How do we develop the right skills, and how can we leverage them? Extract value from them, turn, better skills and better jobs and better lives of people. That's the challenge of our times. And it's not just about, cognitive skills. It's equally about social and emotional skills. Your creativity, your curiosity, your empathy, your leadership, your courage. Those things matter. Trademark applications are another way to make the push to the intangibles visible. Once again, in education, we should ask ourselves, what competencies are needed for participating in this increasingly intangible economy now? What knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values do we need for generating new ideas, new products, or for organizing and governing new ways of working and producing? And what is the role of technology in facilitating that learning? We also see how technology is becoming a big player in the learning itself, making learning more granular, more adaptive, more interactive. While you do mathematics on a computer, the computer can study how you study and then make your learning so much more adapted to your personal learning styles. Learning analytics, teachers can use it to see how different students learn differently and then engage with that diversity in new ways. That's the world in which we live. The way we live and work also shapes the future of education. One thing is clear, those with the right skills never had the life chances they have today, while those who struggle in the transition to the knowledge economy never face the risks they have today. Our labor markets become more sensitive to the skills of people, and that means, they're also going to be better in extracting value from the skills of people. For those with the right skills, that's great. For those without, they may risk to be left further behind. One trend that, may seem so obvious to you is that we actually work less and less. There's been a real shift from work to leisure over the last decades. But again, are we equipped for that? Will we use our leisure sensibly in a fulfilling way, in a way that increases our life satisfaction? Again, we should not just, look at the future of work. We should look at the future of lives and how living and working can be integrated. Same as living and learning. In the past, we used to learn to do the work, and now learning has become the work. Great places of work will always be great places of learning. And then there are new forms of work. You can look at our economy. Digital platform technologies reorganize everything around us. You no longer know what is a large or a small employer. A few people in a great company can change the world. The most important companies these days are no longer created, by a big industry. They're created by a big idea. Often they have the product before they have the money. You no longer know who's the customer and who's the business. Peer-to-peer markets are blurring the boundaries. We go on eBay and Amazon and, sell and buy it in the same ways. And governments are going on this bandwagon as well. And look at this. On the vertical axis, you see the skills of populations as measured by our adult skills survey. And on the horizontal axis, you see the risk of automation. The likelihood that a robot is going to take over your job. And you can see the two are actually quite closely related now. Nations that are great at skilling their people tend to be also nations where actually labor markets are quite well protected from automation. Whereas nations that struggle in the transition to the knowledge economy are also the ones which may lose most of their jobs. So knowledge, skills, attitudes, and value, those are the key. But, when we surveyed 15-year-olds in our PISA study, we can see that there's a large share of them, 30, 40, sometimes 50%, and particularly students from disadvantaged backgrounds, who aspire to jobs that are most at risk to be automated. We often educate our young people, not for their future, but for our past. And then, what do we do with online labor, for example? You can see a clear rise. People, like to work more flexible, take greater ownership over when they work, how they work. Online labor is a good example of this. But if that's the reality, how well are we equipped to help those actually progress in their careers when there is no fixed employer sponsoring their training? What does this shift mean for our education system, for formal, for non-formal education, for educational professionals? What is the potential of new training opportunities emerging from the gig economy? There's fantastic resources, things like GitHub. Amazing resource. How do we use them? We need to answer those questions. And then, knowledge always means power. Look at the massive rises of wikis. In the past, what we heard, what we saw was framed by very few people. A handful of television anchors had a huge influence over lots of people. A handful of newspaper editors wrote what we would be reading about the world. And they usually, did their work well. They carefully, curated what they would be writing. Often what was carefully reviewed. When you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia, and often, or usually, you could trust the answer. You find that to be true. Today, we are all authors. We all contribute knowledge. Everybody can just write what they think. When you don't know the answer to a question, you look it up on Google and, you get 100,000 answers. And nobody's going to tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge from prefabricated information. Literacy now is about constructing knowledge, validating knowledge. Well, that's the demand. But when you look at the reality, you can see here, that's the share of 15-year-olds, according to PISA, who are really good at navigating the internet. And with that, I mean, things like distinguishing fact from opinion, or, navigating different information sources, combining, triangulating knowledge, the kind of skills that you need to be, confident in the digital world. And you can see in Singapore, things look great, or better than in other countries, or Korea, or parts of China. But in most parts of the world, a significant majority of 15-year-olds do not have those skills. And even in Singapore, a third of the 15-year-olds you're going to meet out on the street will not be equipped for the digital world in which they live. Being born into the digital world doesn't mean that you're a digital native. Being able to use your tablet and your mobile phone doesn't mean you can distinguish fact from opinion, navigate complex information sources. The technology has evolved so much faster than our capacity to use it meaningfully, responsibly. It's the 21st century that needs to change that. And then finally, there is no planet B. Let me conclude with a look at the environment. As you can see here, since 1970, our ecological footprint has consistently exceeded our Earth's biocapacity. You can see that here marked by the gray dotted line. Last year, we exceeded it by over 70%. Globally, we lived as if we had 1.7 planets available instead of just the one we have. And if you're an American, you lived as if you had 5 Earths available. That is clearly not sustainable. Well, when we surveyed school leaders, it looked quite optimistic. Now, on average across OECD countries, you can see 9 out of 10 school leaders say, climate change and global warming, that's something that we teach, that's incorporated in our curriculum. And it's similar to gender equality, international conflicts, causes of poverty, migration, hunger, malnutrition, even pandemics. According to school leaders, a lot of effort in school to embed those global forces into the school curriculum. But when we ask students, we got a different picture. 8 out of 10 students say looking after the global environment is important to me. The climate agenda for young people, it's urgent, it's important, it's personal. But when we ask them, can you do something about it? Or do you think what you do is going to make a difference to other people in other places? The bars got a lot shorter. This is the fundamental issue of our times. We've made young people passive consumers of prefabricated knowledge. We do not give them that agency to mobilize their cognitive, social, and emotional resources. That co-agency to work with others to create the future. And that collective agency, which means that the whole is always bigger than the sum of the parts. Some things we can do very practically. After this pandemic, we've seen particularly, vocational education and training is so important. Most of the backbone of our economies during the lockdown was about those kinds of jobs. So you need to think about how we can provide more flexible and resilient vocational training, how we can use technology in more better ways, how we can focus training more on future-oriented jobs. And then how we can enhance a broader range of cognitive, social, and emotional competencies. Let's go through these points. First of all, providing more flexible, resilient means for reskilling. We can allow for more training breaks, extensions, greater modularization, getting away from these lumpy ways of big kind of programs towards giving people greater ownership over what they learn and how they learn and when they learn and where they learn. Skills Future in Singapore is actually a great example of that. We should also be more reactive, more fast-tracking licensing now. Understanding what people know and add value to this rather than sending them through long programs. Sometimes, you can ask people or offer people to directly look for a qualification rather than going through the program because they might have learned what you want to assess in other ways. We also need to become better at, rapidly retraining people. In the pandemic, People in the airline industry lost their jobs, but in the health industry, they needed jobs with quite similar qualifications. Now, how can we move people from where they are to where there is the future? Lots of important questions. And then I mentioned already, using technology better, creating new learning experiences that make learning more interactive, more granular, more adaptive to the learning needs of people. Using learning analytics to see how different learners learn differently and to engage with those differences in more productive, more personal ways. And then, one of the biggest mistakes that we made in education over the last, almost centuries is to divorce learning and assessment. We ask young people, to pile up years and years of learning. And then one day we tell them, come back and tell me everything in a very narrow, constrained kind of setting. That distorts learning. That distorts teaching. The future is about reintegrating learning and assessment, making them two sides of the same coin, and technology can actually facilitate this. We can become better, to reconcile skill demands with individual career aspirations. We can try to work harder on forecasting economic demands. Using methods of data projection, they exist, but also, to get a better sense of what stakeholders think about the future, what they know about the future. Are we training people more rapidly in the short term? In the long term, focus more on the kinds of skills that, are the results of the big drivers of change that are highlighted at the beginning. We do not know the future. That is very clear. But we understand the broad trends that influence that future and that could shape different futures. The better we become at imagining alternative futures and to understand their consequences, the better we will be prepared for the future that eventually arises. And one thing is clear, we used to learn to do the work, and suddenly learning has become the work. This notion of lifelong, life-wide learning is really at the center now. In the past, all was quite simple. You went to school, to university, you got a job, and then you retire. Today, we need to give greater emphasis to early childhood education and care. Some of the skills that are highlighted: curiosity, empathy, courage, leadership. When you're a 5-year-old, those are skills. When you are 25-year-olds, they've almost become personality traits now. You can say that school was the education of the 20th century. Foundations, academic skills. Early childhood education and care is the education of the 21st century. That's where the foundations for the century are really built now. And then, tertiary education needs to become a lot more transversal, better integrating the world of work and the world of learning. And then, good jobs will always be great places of learning, integrating learning and working. But, it's easy to say. It raises some really, really tough questions. Who should pay for that? How do we share the costs and benefits between individuals, employers, governments? It's not so clear, the answer. In school, you say, governments pick up the bill, but what about learning at the workplace? What are the incentives? Who sets the standards? Who knows what good learning is when it gets beyond institutions? How do we recognize that learning? And I mean learning that is not about getting a degree. There's learning at the workplace, learning in life. How do we understand where people add value to their skills? How do employers understand what people know and can do rather than just reading, outdated certificates? Who will train the trainers? And what do we do with people outside firms? For the unemployed, you can say, okay, governments should pick up the bill. That's pretty obvious. But, what about people at risk of losing their job? Who invests in the truck drivers today? 10 years from now, They may all get automated. How do we make sure that today those people see a future, understand their future, learn for that future, build that future? Investing upfront rather than letting people fall into a big hole. What do we do with people who want to change jobs now? Often, job-related training is about improving in your current job. But where do we learn for our next job? What do we do with people in the gig economy who are not in formal employment? Who, manage their own lives. How do they access that learning when they have no employer sponsoring that education? And then, there are always tough questions around governance. Now, when there are new forms of work, sometimes it becomes more difficult to raise taxes from that. Because you're not in employment, you earn money, it's much harder to capture. Decentralized information often means less control. It's harder to understand the big picture. We know how to capture administrative data. We're not so great when it comes actually to look at the big data sources that arise from people's behavior. We see the link between education and jobs weakening. And that means, the job of governments is really, really becoming tougher. And we need to predict, more rapid changes in skill demands and prepare for them. Some people have called all of that a race between technology and education. Before the first industrial revolution, neither technology nor education mattered much for the vast majority of people. But then came the industrial revolution, suddenly moving technology ahead of the skills of people. And it created so much social pain. People were left so badly behind because they were not prepared for the new ways of working. But then, we made people compatible with the ways of working of the industrial economy. We trained them, come to work, discipline, the foundation skills, and so on. It created generations of prosperity. Much of what we have today built on that paradigm and built on that education. But, now we see the digital revolution doing exactly that same thing again. Now moving people ahead of the technology, moving technology ahead of the skills of people. And it's creating the same social pain. Even people with university degrees sometimes have difficulties finding a good job. And employers say, we cannot find the people with the skills we need. The question is again, how do we move people once more ahead of the technologies of our times? And here at this conference, you're going to struggle to find answers to these questions, and that is so important. We need to educate people for their future, not for our past. We need to think about the cognitive, the social, the emotional foundations for our future. Thank you very much.